Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos. Good afternoon and welcome to La Calle 24 Spring Film Festival event. In recognition of International Women's Day, which was celebrated on March 8th, but we were on spring break, the films and conversation today will focus on Indigenous women in Latin American cinema. La Calle 24 Film Festival, which began in the fall and will run through the end of May, highlights Spanish language films, and in this case, one in a Mayan dialect called Cachiquel. We'll focus on Indigenous and Latinx communities in the United States and Latin America. And the film screenings are preceded by a plática, or conversation about the films and the broader social, cultural, and political themes they illuminate. So La Calle 24 Film Festival is part of the Center for Mexican American Studies Raza Heritage Programming. And I am your host, Dr. Aimee Villarreal. I'm assistant professor and program head of the Comparative Mexican American Studies program, and I'm also the director of the Research Center. And before we begin our program, just a few reminders. The attendees are muted right now, but you're encouraged to use the chat function to comment throughout the presentation. We also invite you to post your questions for the guest speaker using the Q&A function. And we'll also do our best to relay your questions following the presentation to the panelists. We are also live streaming this event on the OLU Center for Mexican American Studies Facebook page. So those of you who are joining us on Facebook can use the comment section to post your questions. So today we have a special double feature of Ixcanul Volcan, directed by Jairo Bustamante, and it's a film set in Guatemala and steeped in Mayan folklore. It's about a 17-year-old Cachiquel Maya woman who plans to escape an arranged marriage to the foreman of the coffee plantation where her family lives and works as sharecroppers. And we also have Entretejido, which explores the alpaca fabric supply chain from animal to textiles and the intersections between indigenous weaving collectives and high fashion in Peru. The films are available to view starting today. Ixtanul Volcan is screening on La Calle 24 Film Festival site, and Entretejido is a short ethnographic film, and it is screening for free on Vimeo only on Friday all day, but OLU affiliates can also watch the film on Canopy for free, courtesy of the Sotsunfus Library. So the links to view both films are going to be posted in the chat, and there you can see them on our Facebook page. So today we welcome my colega, Dr. Patricia Alvarez Astacio, and she is also the director of Entretejido. And Dr. Alvarez is a Puerto Rican filmmaker and an anthropologist whose scholarly research and creative practice develops in the folds between ethnography, critical theory, sensory ethnography, and the documentary arts. Her most recent works converge on issues of gender and ethnic representation in neoliberal, post-authoritarian Peru. She is currently working on her book manuscript, Moral Fibers, Making Fashion Ethical, which analyzes how Indigenous women artisans and their aesthetic traditions become part of an ethical fashion manufacturing network. Her films have screened in galleries, museums, and national and international film festivals. Currently, Dr. Alvarez is assistant professor in the anthropology department, the Latin American and Latino Studies program, and the film, TV, and interactive media program at Brandeis University. So, bienvenida, Patricia, y muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy.
Thanks for the warm welcome and the invitation. Really excited to be here.
Yes, so the first half of our plática will focus on Ixtanul Volcan, and then we'll discuss the making of Entretejido, your film. So I thought we could begin with the trailer of Ixtanul to give our audience a little bit of context about the film that we're watching today.
Allah, magkhan, Allah, makatig. Allah, yuk, katuh siya. Allah, yuk, Allah, takakit ka makatig. Kung magkahali ko makatig. Tichin da balkwar, tichin makatig. Tios kastir kulpek. Nung kasi baka na, tichakir nung kastichin. Stigway kan ba yung chut. Arni baka uchiri balkwar, arni baka uchiri balkwar.
Maria, you can launch out. Chilina Parish Kanun Koristas. Kolimanahai. Kairi Kutsi.
Nishita Vira.
Terima kasih. Saya kasih maupun kali ini kita apa coba? Saya malam ya adalah.
Oke. Kasi kacang aku sudah wahwi. Cinta beliau ya. Kelas dengan cawa. Niya ako nakapasa rin kanon. Kaya pe. Şimdi pozna kala ihat kala patachich.
Okay, so I guess we'll jump right into the themes that are represented in the film. So I guess we had a prep conversation about this, and we kind of talked about how this film breaks with some of the conventions that you often see as far as the representation of Indigenous people and Indigenous women in particular. Can you talk about some of those conventions and also how this film might break with some of them?
Yeah, no, I think part of the beauty and the importance of the film is that not only is it's the first Guatemalan film in Indigenous language, but this structure of the film and the story, right, kind of respects Indigenous forms of storytelling and of conveying information, right? I don't want to give too much away. But the film tells the story in a way it kind of ends where it begins, right? It's kind of this spiral-like story, right? It's not this linear history. And as well, it does a really great job weaving in, you know, kind of very significant forces and Maya ways of being, right? So we see, you know, the volcano and the landscape. We have figures like the serpent that we in the West might consider to be myths, right? Myths, mythologies, the beliefs, but that when we move outside of this Western framework, these are sources of knowledge. They shape how people are in the world, and that are part of people's history, right? So you have what we would consider kind of myth, not working as myth, but being part of this reality, part of the characters of the film and the forces that shape and move the story, saying that these are valuable forms of understanding the world we live in. They're not just beliefs or myths that people have. So we have, you know, the volcano as a character. The landscape is so important in the film alongside the human actors. And I think the film also does a really great job in kind of challenging the tropes through which historically Indigenous communities have been represented for a really, really long time.
Right. And so we're going to unpack kind of each of those ideas as we move through the conversation. So the film begins with an arranged marriage between 17-year-old Maria and the much older hacienda foreman, Ignacio. Yet Maria has other plans. And if you watch the film or the trailer, which you just have, you get the impression that this is going to be a migration story, right? This kind of like, you know, the one that we always hear, right? Indigenous people having to leave their lands and migrate to the United States. And that's one of the characters' trajectory, but not necessarily Maria's trajectory. So can you tell us a little bit about how Maria is rebelling against this marriage and why?
Right. So, you know, Maria's marriage is a very convenient and beneficial one for her family, right? Who, as you see in the film, live in pretty precarious conditions in a land that is theirs, but not theirs within a capitalist regime, right? It's owned by someone else. And Maria doesn't want to get married to this figure who is a very interesting figure. He's, I guess we could characterize him as mestizo or Ladino, you know, he's grew up in the area, he speaks the language, he's steeped in the traditions, but he also speaks Spanish. And kind of is very familiar with the world outside of the indigenous community. And in that position, he kind of enforces the power of the kind of property owners, right? Which I think the film also can make us question this idea of owning land as well. And he is this kind of force, this kind of weird colonial force, right? That enforces the violence, economic and other kinds of violence of this kind of plantation system that we oftentimes like to think it's ended, but continues to this day, with many people living as sharecroppers and under conditions of indentured servitude. And Maria doesn't want this marriage, right? She wants to take agency and control over her own body and future. And I think the film, one of the twists of the film, it's really easy to think a way out is to migrate and leave the community. This is a story we get told a lot, but it's not the only story, right? It's not the only way people challenge and resist forces of oppression put upon them. And so, yes, while Maria in the beginning tries to flee, find ways to leave and go beyond the Volcan and go to the US, that ultimately is actually not even, you know, not the pathway that she takes, right? Going for her to the US is not about the American dream, right? It's about gaining control and maybe moving herself outside of this kind of system of indentured servitude. And I think it's really important to also to have more complex stories about migration, and also question the trope of coming to the US for the American dream, right? That is one story, but there are many other kind of complex stories, like what happens to the migrant who can't make it, what happens to people that have those desires to right some social injustices in their life through other means, what happens to those who return for whatever reasons, and what happens to those who come to the US or to Mexico or to other places, maybe not because they want to improve their lives, right? There's many reasons for leaving as well.
Right, and I think that you might get the impression from the trailer that she wants to escape her traditional community. But I think that that's not the case. I think that, as you mentioned, it's about escaping that system of coloniality, right? That system of colonialism in which she is embedded, as well as her family. And I think the Ignacio, the person she's supposed to marry, represents all of that to her in a way. And that's why she's rejecting and rebelling against him. And so what she does is she finds a lover, and this lover is also going to migrate to the United States. And we don't get the impression that he's necessarily knows what he's doing, but he's very young. He likes to party. He has this idea that he's going to go across the Volcan, and he doesn't really have a sense of what's beyond it, right? But she decides that she's going to escape with him. but instead she gets caught, right, as she's trying to find him. And she ends up with a pregnancy. And so I also thought that the film represents female sexuality and power in different ways and breaks again with our stereotypes and our conventions. So could you talk a little bit about how female sexuality, and particularly involving Indigenous women, is being represented here?
Yeah. Before I go to that, I also want to make one quick comment about Pepe, like her lover, right? He's planning to go to the US, but he doesn't even speak Spanish, right? He only speaks Cachiquel. And I think this goes back to those kind of erased stories of migration where we assume everyone coming from Central Latin America they're Spanish speakers, right? They're Latinx folks, right? And really not thinking about the diversity of those experiences. Like, you know, how do you make it to the US when you don't even speak right Spanish, right? How do those kind of, how that shapes a different migratory path and experience in the United States, where it's really easy to not see the richness of our Indigenous kind of fellow Indigenous Latinx community members under our kind of large umbrella of being Latinx here. So just brief that. So I was thinking about that recently in different conversation. But yes, the female sexuality, I think, like, you know, the film affirms you know, and in, you know, it kind of an Indigenous, you know, way of approaching sexuality, even though we outside of, you know, those of us who are not Indigenous, right, we can think about the many ways in which sexuality can be empowering, but the film also, you know, how to say this, kind of treats it almost outside of our kind of moral frameworks, even the moral frameworks where we find sexuality empowering, right? You know, the transgression that Maria commits is, it's not about having sex out of wedlock or making that decision, but it's about the problem that pregnancy poses for this marriage, and a marriage with a person, right, who as an liminal figure is invested in ideas about, you know, patriarchy, the Catholic Church, marriage, monogamy, which don't exactly kind of operate in the film. So Maria takes control through her sexuality in a way that it's not kind of immoral, that it's not transactional as well. Like, we see her in various instances, like thinking through her decision. There's this very interesting scene where she's, you know, kind of touching a tree, and it has this kind of very interesting and unique way of representing female sexuality and empowerment that's like very distinct. Even her mom, when she talks to her mom that she's pregnant, it's not about, oh, you're not a virgin anymore, right? It's about, did you count, I think her mom says, did you count your moons? is the answer, right? It's about, you know, the issue with the pregnancy in light of this arranged marriage, right? So it's a really interesting, different way of thinking about how sexuality can be empowering and reclaimed, right, outside of our regular morality. And even the issue of abortion and terminating a pregnancy, right, operates completely outside this framework. It's not, doesn't carry this like moral weight and transgression, like she's doing something horrible. It's an option, and it gets, you know, tried out, but the baby had decided to come. So we also need to accept that reality, because the decision to terminate a pregnancy in this context, it's not just attributed to the mother, but it's also about the mother, you know, the future baby, and that entity's decision to stay or not stay. And it's also almost a communal decision if we think about the ways in which the volcano and the relationship with the power of the volcano also plays a part. So it's almost like a debate between multiple actors, rather than this kind of act charged with immorality.
Right. So there is also a scene where her mother talks about her being magical or having more power as as a pregnant woman. And we see that their lives, of course, are precarious, and at this time even more so because the coffee plantation has been infested with snakes. And this is going to, of course, ruin the crop. And so her mother tells her, right, that she has power, that the snakes won't bite her, that everywhere she touches, that things will grow, that she should touch the plants, that she should be, be in places where things are growing because her fertile powers will affect the environment and the environment will affect her. And so this also, starts a chain of events, right, of in Maria's story. So we see through her understanding of her own power, she wants to save her family. And I think that might have been her inspiration all along, right? That she wanted her family out of this colonial situation. And so she decides to walk into the pit of snakes, right? And she gets bitten, and then she is rushed to the hospital. And this is where we see how Indigenous people are, what the relationship is, right, between Indigenous people and the settler state, as they are trying to navigate through the city of Guatemala and Guatemala City, I believe, and also go to the hospital and what transpires there. And we see all kinds of violence enacted on these people. And also they don't seem to be afraid to go to the city, but the city is blocking them thwarting them at every stop. And we could see how they're mistreated throughout the way. So can you tell us a little bit about how the colonial state is represented here?
Yeah, and it's the one moment in the film where we're outside, right? Outside of the territory of the volcán. And it's a moment where we see a different regime of gender and medicalization and different attitudes towards female sexuality kind of being violently imposed upon Maria and her body. I think that, that scene that Amy, that you mentioned with the snakes is so powerful. And I don't want to give too much away, but I also feel like there's a way in which it's a very complex moment where what happens there leaves the door open for us to take seriously forms of Indigenous knowledge and take seriously the understanding of the pregnant woman as someone who has the power of the volcán almost inside of her, that's like bursting literally with life, but also can make us think about why did the events happen in the way, right? Is it because there's doubt? Is it because other ideas are imposed upon us that might make us doubt the forces and the power we have, and other beliefs and forms of knowledge? And so, and it's very, I think because of that, it's extremely powerful, but it's also the reason why we go out into the city. And I think the film is very bounded, but even though we're only outside of the community when they're going to the hospital, I feel like the filmmaker Jairo Bustamante does such a great job showing the different levels of violence, right, that are constantly experienced, right, through the figure of the foreman, through the precarious position of the family. Where do they go? Where do I get work, right? Even with Pepe before he migrates, like, how do people get paid? And, what's that relationship for the value of their work? But then once we go out of there, right, we see then a settler state that is invested in keeping the communities seemingly bounded through not so subtle ways, right? In which we see a nation state that doesn't define the services that it provides to their citizens, like healthcare, as extending to Indigenous women at all. And it's not for her, it's not for them. No one speaks, they don't have translators. They actually have to rely on the foreman to translate, let doctors go and do what they do to Maria without the family knowing what's happening. And you see the force of the prejudice, right? As these peoples are kind of backwards and should stay over there. And even the consequences of medical intervention where, you know, you know, the desire to allow the literal biological reproduction and with it cultural reproduction of Maya communities is just not wanted, right? That it's a state and a medical system that is invested in the binding and erasing the population through very traumatic means that are state sanctioned. There's a whole system in place that supports treating Maria and her family the way they do.
And so she is told that, well, we'll just say that the baby, where the baby goes is a question. So we know that the baby doesn't come home with her. And so they have a funeral in her home community, but the question remains of, was the baby taken at the hospital? And as you say, you know, the settler state is invested in ensuring that Indigenous people remain bounded or disappear, and that reproduction, you know, the having children is very essential to that process. And so the other process is the process of assimilation. And so the settler state has often, even here in the United States, taken Native children away from their families in order to save the baby or save the person and kill the Indian, right? Kill the Indigenous culture off. And so that question remains, I think, hanging in the end, which was actually very compelling. So the last, I guess I'd like to talk a little bit about the land, you know, and as symbolism. And, you know, you also talked about these contrasts between the Indigenous community and the outside, right? Outside the Volcan. And so can we talk about the land itself as a character in the film? And I also want to say that the cinematography is just impressive. It's just absolutely breathtaking. And so the land as an actual character in this film.
Yeah, no, you know, if we name the characters in the film, you could not include the volcano, right? Like the volcano is like such a central character in the film, as is the figure of the snake as well. And I think one of the, you know, once we go out of the community, we go into the city, cinematically speaking, formally speaking, right? The shots and the cuts are quicker, camera movements are faster, the sound build up, right? It's more intense, to the point where we cannot see the city anymore, right? And I think that's a moment as viewers that maybe even subconsciously we can start thinking about how big of a character the landscape is, because if it's not a character, we don't see it, we don't inhabit it. And so the city is this place that is just full of movement, it's confusing, it's disorienting, it doesn't give space for the characters to be in. And we see that through the camera, through the use of sound, through the cutting, right? Whereas when we're back in the community, we have these shots where people are always in place, right? With people are always shown in relationship to the land, the work they do in the land, how they move through the land, and how everything happens through relationships that are invisible but felt with the volcano and the power and the centrality of the volcano, right? Like people work the land, you know, sustaining their own relations of responsibility with the land, right? Which is why they know how to deal with the snakes, and there's different ways of doing it, or even when you shouldn't be planting, right? But a capitalist system of production is not going to tell you, oh, you know, we shouldn't be planting the season because we need to make money. And so if you notice the cinematography in the film, rarely we just get those kind of super close-ups where just, you know, like humans are isolated. Like humans are never isolated from their environment. They're always in interaction with their environment, and you know the forces of the snakes and the volcano, right, are always kind of at play and moving throughout the film alongside the characters as well. So, you know, we see a lot of bigger, wider shots. The pacing of the film is slower, so we can inhabit, but also look and maybe even start identifying those connections that exist with the non-human characters in the film as well. And if you look closely, you know, it even allows you to see the ways in which the settler state and its capitalist system of production attempts to parcel, manage, and control the land, right? We see fences, we see roads, but if we look closely, right, we see how the characters, including the snakes, right, move through different pathways, right? Because those alternate pathways, right, in a way respond to knowledge of the land, to the responsibility they have to land and to each other. And so you see them jumping the fences, the pua. Maria, you know, rarely walks on the main paths. Actually, when she walks through the main road, that's when she gets caught, right? The people you see walking the main roads are the workers, right? Who are being moved into this kind of pathway of managing nature and culture that the settler states have, right? After they get paid, they all go down the road, right?
So I think that that was a really brilliant way to describe it, because the filmmaker, instead of treating Indigenous people as timeless, she walks a balance, right, between Indigenous time and space and settler time and space. We see that radical contrast. However, we understand that the Indigenous people are not out of time, right? They are, of course, deeply embedded, right, in late post-capital colonialism. And so even though that contrast is apparent, it's not, I guess it's not saying that Indigenous people are in their own time or timeless. And that's another trope, right, that we get when in films that represent Native people. So students and everybody, look out for that, especially in those Westerns that you think you love, right? Yes. And so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap this conversation with Indigenous storytelling, because the story ends at the same place it begins. And so you were talking about the spiraling of storytelling, the mytho-historical time, the no separation between myth and the objective life. And so instead of a linear story or narrative that we are used to, right, within Western traditional ways of narrating stories, Indigenous stories are often overlapping, they're spiraling, they start at the same place where they began, they finish in the same place where they began. The story might start over, but have different characters and different narratives, yet maybe the theme will stay kind of constant. So I thought that that was a really brilliant way to kind of show that spiraling storytelling. Did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say to add to that, also the ways in which, you know, the mytho-historical, like the knowledge of myth is history, right? The separation is a Western separation imposed upon us, that history is this thing, and that whatever knowledge and experience we have from things that have happened with the volcan or with the ways we work the land, if there are snakes or not, right? Like, oh, that's like myth because it's not narrated in a certain way, but like the film kind of maintains that mythos as history and as knowledge and as objective, and it does so showing how it interacts, right, with this kind of settler time without having one overshadow the other or having to make one more real than the other. And I think that also part of the big power of this kind of spiraling technique and this blurring of history and knowledges is that really makes us think about the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism that aren't over, and that, you know, how many times is the same spiral? How many times are we going back to the same place, right? Is Maria's history, you know, ending where it started? And how many times for hundreds of years has that been happening? And it's also telling us if things don't change, this story will continue happening. And I think many Indigenous storytellers talk about the figure of the spiral because the story is never quite the same, even if there are overlaps. And if they end up in a similar point, right? There's always change, but that change doesn't mean that we're outside of the structure that keeps oppressing communities, right? And so her story, in a way, Maria is Maria and is an individual, but Maria is also hundreds of thousands of Indigenous women across many centuries. And we can also think about, right, Amy, when you're talking about, right, the history of taking children away from Indigenous communities, the histories of forced sterilizations upon, you know, Indigenous women, Latinx women, you know, in the US and throughout Latin America, right? Like we're kind of still in this spiral that can probably come back.
Right. Wow. Yes, that was really deep, a really deep analysis there. So we're going to break before we'll take a little break before we move on to Entretejido. And I'd like to see if there's any questions about the conversation so far, and you can put them in the chat. So far, I have one question, and the question is, how is Maria inspired to rebel? Who or what is her model to follow? And so this person is trying to see, well, how does she know, you know, that this is the way to go?
She doesn't, or at least we don't know as viewers, right? We don't know. We might speculate, right? Is it, you know, that she's knows people from her community are migrating and stories are coming from outside, and that she knows that there's other ways of living life? Is it because she's seeing the conditions of precarity and injustice that frame her family's lives for many generations? Is she, you know, simply just does not want to get married to this guy, right? Like, and the ways in which she decides to do it through her own sexuality, like we don't know, right? The director leaves that undisclosed, but you feel her discontent, right? You feel that this is so important and she's gonna take matters into her own hand, right? That decisiveness starts and runs through the film, even in the ending, which can be read, you know, in many different ways. But, you know, I think the ending, you also see her resolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that it's also somewhat sad and disempowering in a way, because she's unable to escape her conditions of life. But at the same time, that's real.
Yeah.
Right?
And
That's
if
the reality.
And if it's circular, she might find at some point another way to push or challenge, right? Like, I think after seeing that story, and if we think about that spiralness, you know, she might come up with some other creative solution.
Exactly. We don't know what the next story will tell. So I'd like to transition now to your film, and I'm going to go ahead and show the trailer, and then we'll talk about Entretejido.
Sí, todos. Hemos nacido.
Con la tripa de su madre ha tejido todavía en el pie.
Yo, señorita, desde pequeña, viendo otras personas que tejen, aprendí a tejer yo también. Igualito, sino que los colores y el dibujo nos vamos a cambiar. Igualito. Pero ya, tú ya vas a matizar. Pues yo también estoy matizando con los hilitos. ¿A qué matices?
Todo van cabel cansado en tejer. Todo van cabel cansado en tejer. No, claro, no hemos sabido a tejer bien con todas las perfecciones, después ya podemos perfeccionar. Con las capacitaciones que nos dan, con eso ya más nos hemos capacitado, hemos aprendido ya todo, el acabado, todo. Y cuando no hay trabajitos, para la familia. Cuando tenemos trabajo, ya nos olvidamos de la comida.
Okay, so beautiful. Those are just beautiful images, and the whole film is just the cinematography is really gorgeous. But before we talk about the clip, I want to emphasize that the two films that we're screening are radically different, right? So Ichkanul is a narrative film with actors, some community actors, some professional actors, and yours is a ethnographic film. So can you tell us how an ethnographic film is different from a documentary?
Sure. um, so ethnographic films are a kind of documentary, right? Documentaries have different genres. We're more familiar with what we see, you know, in PBS that has a bunch of like interviews with experts, and then we might have some scenes. We also have character-driven documentary films, which follow a couple of people, and we explore an issue through their lives, through their work, through their activism, right, and so on, and you know, or just about their lives. So ethnographic films are films that tend to, how to say this, they emerge out of a process of ethnographic fieldwork, right? So we're maybe not as invested in telling a story, but following following and exploring certain social and cultural issues that take seriously and I think pose a particular set of responsibilities to the communities we work with, and that in many cases can be our collaborators, right? We're not trying to speak for anyone. I'm not trying to tell someone's story, but I'm trying to explore alongside the people that I've been working with certain issues about, in this case, the importance and impact of their work in fashion markets, right? As Quechua artisans. And so it's a film that's trying to explore a social cultural phenomena. Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because I think more and more there's so much overlap, but ethnographic films tend to be more observational, right? So you don't find a lot of interviews, right? My experts are the people I'm working with, right? So if I don't need anyone justifying their knowledge. So I'm more interested in showing, right? Certain experiences, certain processes that are significant to understanding, labor in this context, or understanding how traditions change, right? Or understanding their experience without having to tell you with any voice of authority. I think it's also important to immerse people and bring them close, and do so carefully to avoid exoticizing and othering people, but rather to create connections of empathy and care, which don't always happen in documentary films. I think a documentary film, if you watch a documentary about a social issue and you walk out of there and say, oh, that really sucks, I feel for them, I'm so happy that that happens elsewhere to someone else, like that is a documentary that's not creating empathy and care. Right.
And even in the clip that we see the meaning of knitting, right, of weaving, to these women and there doesn't have to be necessarily an interview. We see them working, we see their children present, we see children learning the trade. We see the idea that she was knitting in the womb, that this is a long tradition, and she laughs about it, but it seems like, and another woman saying how everybody just knows how to knit, right? Everybody just knows about weaving. And so kind of the cultural embeddedness of this space and the relationships between the women and in this, collective space. So just the clip, I think, shows us a little bit about your technique as an ethnographic filmmaker. We are watching this kind of alongside of you, and it's very difficult to walk that line, right, between exoticizing and observing. But I think that the way that you shot the film is very observational, right? And so could you talk a little bit about the clip and what you were doing at that moment?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The distributor shows a scene from the film. That's not the trailer. The trailer, because the film moves between the different spaces of the supply chain, right? So there's moments with herders, alpaca herders, and shearing, and the making of thread, and then we move into the artisan space that you all saw, and then there's a fashion designer that comes in to work with them, right, to make a fashion collection, and then it actually ends in a runway for ethical, social, responsible, sustainable fashions, which in Latin America means working with artisans and incorporating indigenous aesthetics into fashionable styles. And so yeah, so that's just like you guys saw, just like one small segment, and it's really hard to make a film that doesn't either exoticize or that falls back on those historically problematic representations of Indigenous communities. And I think maybe that's like the one point of contact I feel between the two films, that I think both films find ways to not do that, right? In Ixcanul, even though we see women dressed in traditional outfits, the way they're shot, the way they're placed in the landscape, the actions, how they speak, their voice, like refuses to exoticize, doesn't let us exoticize them. It also, even if people are more quiet, they're also not the stoic Indian, right? Because they have so much agency and it's so much complicated, and they're always in relation to nature or what they're doing, or even with the knowledge that's being transmitted. And I think that for me as a documentary, as an ethnographic filmmaker, I didn't want to reproduce those images. I wanted to problematize those images, and I wanted us to also problematize the assumptions we have about Indigenous traditions and Indigenous crafts, right? And so, yes, it's embedded. Kids learn since they're very young. People have a unique knowledge of the material itself, which it's part of the film. But at the same time, people go to hire them thinking, oh, you guys do this since the Inca Empire. It's genetic, so I love that moment, because in a way, with the womb comment, it's like a joke. And it's a joke because it's like, yeah, it's so embedded and we learned since we're kids. But she's also making fun of people from the industry that, think that they're knitting literally in the womb, and it's kind of hilarious for them. And I think that brings a kind of humanity and a more rounded way of us thinking about Indigenous people as humans who have sense of humor, who can laugh, who can be self-reflexive about their lives, that exist in the present, even as they maintain and protect their traditions, their forms of knowledge, and so on and so forth. I also, really like that scene because not everyone is dressed in the traditional outfit. There are women in pollera, but not everyone as well, to kind of also, make us think about the ways in which Indigenous folks in Latin America are invisibilized, right? There's so many people with Indigenous heritage or who are Indigenous moving around that are easy to not see because they're not dressed in the exotic, or not exotic, but the traditional ways that we imagine them. And I also played a lot with the close-ups of the knitting, because I think that, textile work is something that is done in many, many cultures. And to me, bringing people really close and having us just look at hands working can add another layer of saying, well, what they're making is distinct, right? This is not something that gets made everywhere in the world, but my grandma knits, or I do this, or my mom taught me, and in that sense, kind of counterbalance the urge to say, ooh, look at the colors, this is so unique, wow, right? I wanted us to be able to recognize that, but also to see it as something intimate and familiar, that we can come close to without it being so different and so exotic and so other.
Right. And I was really struck with the alpaca, because I don't have a relationship with the alpaca. I am actually from northern New Mexico, and I do have a relationship with sheep. And also seeing the process of shearing sheep and how it's spun into wool, and also how both Nuevo Mexicana and Indigenous people use the textile to make rugs or to make clothing or to make colcha, embroidery. So I had that cultural knowledge just from, living in northern New Mexico. So I saw the relationship. But the alpaca, their noises are so different. They sound almost human, and the noises keep interrupting in the film, the alpaca noises, or their voices. So in a way, the alpacas speak too. And they share their story in the film. And I thought that was really beautifully done. So can you talk about how you shot the alpacas and the process of shearing and just what was it like to be out there in El Campo? It was beautiful,
Yeah.
by the way.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I'm glad that their voices come through. It was very intentional of me. Um, it was really hard to shoot because alpacas are herded between kind of almost 4,000 meters to 5,000 meters, which is 15,000 feet, 12 to 15,000 feet above sea level. And as you know, many can assume those are areas kind of abandoned by the state. There's really rough access to road. The roads are awful conditions. No electricity, no running water. It's cold. The winds. I'm from the Caribbean, so I was particularly cold, and it was really tough. Eventually, I got used to the altitude, but yeah, you also have to follow the rhythm of people's lives and when they go out herding and learn, and be open to the rhythms and to interacting with the animal and, seeing, I didn't shoot everything because I also wanted to just kind of go and be there and follow something so foreign. I originally didn't know I was going to film the shearing or that part of the supply chain. But then it became really important because artisans, a lot of them have herds. They take a break and they take the animals to herd and then they come back or they go to the seasonal spots. So then some artisans aren't around for a month because they're, moving them across pasture. So I realized the importance. It's also very gendered. Men are the ones who shear. And so I also had little access to that because of my own gender and I only had the opportunity, so I when I was filming the shearing, it was really hard with the wind. I didn't have the same opportunity to just go and be with the men who were dealing with the animals all the time. I just got to go to when these moments were happening. And so it was tough, and it's a scene that every time I show the film in the US, I get questions about like, are the animals okay? That feels so violent. And I'm just like, it's a big animal, right? Like you gotta immobilize it for its own, you don't want to hurt it. But it was quite an experience to film it and to see the relationship, right? How how they're herded, how they're treated one by one, but also, right, like there's no subtitles, but the men are talking while they're shearing, and they're talking about a wedding that just happened as they were shearing the alpaca. And I didn't subtitle it because I didn't want to distract people, and I just wanted us to see, right, what's the knowledge, how this has happened, how the animal is treated, how the material, where does it come from. And I wanted to play with the voice of the alpacas throughout the film to also kind of a move against commodity fetishism. I wanted us to not forget where this come from, right? We buy clothing and the last thing we think about is where did that cotton grow and under what conditions, right? Was that animal, like the animal, if it was like an animal based fabric like sheep's wool or anything, right? Like what we're kind of connected to that animal literally through our skin. And so I wanted us to not forget about that. And I also wanted to keep it because for my interlocutors, for the artisans, right, the wool itself has a really big role in Andean communities, right? And it matters and it's important. So I needed to take that seriously. And so what are the ways in which I can maintain that reminder that this animal and the relationship humans have with it is important? And then in the films, there are like other moments where we have alpacas, but from videos that appear in runways, to kind of show the translation of that in the fashion world, which doesn't, it's kind of very exotic and
It's really interesting. I thought the runway show was one of the most interesting scenes, because the Indigenous women are there and they have on their outfits and they're looking fly, right? And they're looking amazing. And then you have these haughty models that are at least a foot taller than them and, you know, posing for pictures, but, you know, kind of like, I don't know if I want to take a picture with this person. And so you see this contrast. And I think that the women, the Indigenous women, are very dignified there in that space. And but it's really the contrast between the models and the Indigenous women is very interesting. So could you tell us more about that scene?
yes. So I still I have so much feelings about that, even though I'm writing about it, because in a way, you know, fashion is such an elite space, right? So even when Indigenous artisans and herders have been part of this industry for so long, they've always been denied access, right? Because they're seen as, again, modern, unmodern, right? Outside of this. And so their work has always been erased. So they're coming in there with a lot of pride that they're finally getting recognition now that we have this turn to artisanal, revitalizing artisanal work, saying that Indigenous aesthetics and design can be fashion, right? And ethics and sustainability in the fashion industry. So they're very proud that they're getting the visibility and recognition to be in that space finally. But at the same time, they know that their entrance and recognition in that space is conditional. If they're not wearing their traditional dress, they're not going to go out on the runway and they're not going to be seen, right? So there's a level of exotization that conditions how they enter. So yes, they walk hand in hand with the fashion designer at the end of the runway, but they have to come in full traditional dress, right?
They're not wearing the same clothes as the models, in other words.
Or anything else they might want to wear, right? Like, you know, and in a way, I hate to say this, but in a way, then they kind of also become interchangeable, right? As long as they're dressed a certain way, any member, any artisan can just go in and walk, right? Like they're also not seen as individuals. And the dress gets more visibility than they do. And then there's the added tension of the models, right? You have all this like models, you know, the clothing, there's all this Indigenous inspired or collaborations. There's all this fashion collaborations with Indigenous communities across Latin America, in Africa with different tribes. It's like all over the place. But if you look at the models, they're the same white, thin, European looking models everywhere in the world you go. So on the one hand, there's a saying that Indigenous designs and textiles and crafts are beautiful, are modern, you know, they're here to stay, you know, it's a source of work and income for many people around the world. It's less exploitative than working in a maquila, but then they also know that what's being made is not for them and their bodies, right? Which is another level of exclusion. So then it's just so weird to see these models and this like high fashion polleras dressed next to an Indigenous woman wearing a pollera, and it's like the celebration of this over here that's about the Indigenous artisan and her culture, but it's also not for her, and that's very uncomfortable and it's very messy. And so yeah, that's why that scene, I anything that has to do with that part, I just have so many feelings about it.
Yes, it is kind of like the epitome of capitalist extraction, and also the putting of, and women's bodies, right? If you think about different kinds of bodies in this space, different kinds of female bodies and male bodies in this space, and how they are adorned, you know. But it is a really striking scene. So I thought that Entretejido does a beautiful job of weaving, right? The whole the narrative is actually a weaving of how fashion, high fashion is related from the animal to the shearing, to the knitting, to the design, to the actual show and the wearing of the product. So it's really a fascinating film, and it's short. So I encourage all of you to watch it. It's going to be available for free tomorrow, one day on Vimeo, and Olu affiliates can watch it at any time on Canopy. And so I also encourage you to, professors out there and also students, to show it in class. It'd be wonderful since we have access to it. Well, I think we are out of time, and I didn't want to take too much of everyone's time, but I want to thank you so much, Dr. Alvarez, for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation about Indigenous women in cinema, and I hope that you will join us again in the future.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This was so much fun. And yeah, anytime. This is great.
Okay, and you can see that on Facebook, and it's there for you. It's recorded if you need to forward it to anyone. All right, it was wonderful. And